Welcome back to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. Today we're covering a bird that has been a bit of a viral sensation online, the shoebill. This African bird has a uniquely large bill and is really unlike any other bird in the world. John has actually seen them in the wild before, and John and Shannon have a number of them in their collection at the Field Museum. They're so cool, and also kinda spooky. If you haven't picked out a Halloween costume yet, you may decide to be a shoebill after hearing this episode. Okay, let's go get our binoculars and let's get started. Welcome back, everyone. So to continue with our Halloween theme so far this month, we're talking about another spooky bird. Or at least I think it's spooky. Shannon suggested this one, the shoebill, and we're really excited to hear more about it.
It's one of my favorite birds because it always inspires, what? And people think it's a prehistoric bird. This thing is very tall, 3.5 feet tall to taller, 4.5 feet tall, and it has the weirdest beak of one of the most unique beaks of birds outside of maybe flamingos, and they move really interestingly. They're just so incredibly cool, and they specialize on lungfish, which is kind of weird too. So there are amazing videos of them that you can see online hunting lungfish. Have you seen the one in the wild, John?
Yep. In
Really?
Mabamba Swamp in Lake Victoria in Uganda.
Wow.
And they're as impressive alive as you'd think. And the scientific name is Balaniceps rex, which I love because it basically whale head and then the word rex, which is clearly indicative of sort of kings and the fact that it's so impressive. And it's, evolutionarily, it's an incredibly interesting bird. They're native to these upper reaches of the Nile River Valley and the upper Zambezi River Valley. And if you look at the maps, the distributions will look like it's a fairly broad spread across eastern Africa, but they're very localized because these swamps are really localized. And so their populations are not particularly large. There's a lot of concern about them from a conservation standpoint just because these swamps get drained for architecture.
They're fairly common in zoos, though.
They are.
Many zoos have them. We have 12 specimens in our collections of them, and several of them are actually from zoos. And one of the other reasons why I love this bird, well, there's a couple, but they have a tortured taxonomic past. Nobody knew. No, they've been put in different orders of birds with different families of birds because a shoebill is so unique. It just looks like itself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It doesn't really look like other things. And so it's been with storks. It's been with herons. It's been all over the non-songbird tree of life. But it turns out we have DNA of one that we put into a study that we published quite a few years ago now that showed that its closest living relatives are pelicans and hammerkops, which is another weird bird.
What's a hammerkop?
So that's a small heron-like bird with a bill that, unlike the shoebill, which is big and wide and deep, hammerkop is wide at the top, but it's very narrow. So it's got just like shoebill, it's got a very unique bill shape. And they live in the same parts of Africa, although they're much more widespread. And they're frog specialists.
Okay.
And so, again, these are related, but as Shannon was saying, I mean, the tortured history of these birds is that nobody expected them to actually be related to the pelicans, although there was a morphological study done by your postdoc advisor, Joel Craycraft at the American Museum of Natural History, who looked at morphology and got a data set together and said, I think they're most closely related to pelicans. Mm-hmm. And everybody laughed at him pretty much. And
so they're more closely related to pelicans than pelicans are to other things in the Pelecaniformes.
Wow.
So
all that.
so that's a really unique bird nested within another group of birds, which once we start getting data happens pretty frequently in looking at the bird tree of life. But so when you find out something that's that cool, you're like, wow, that's something.
Yeah.
You know?
And at least hammerkops and shoebills are, again, co-occurring in large parts of Africa. And so that makes sense, but they're clearly been evolving separately for a long period of time and have developed these really interesting morphological bill shapes that allow them to do what they do. And as Shannon's saying, these shoebills live in these swamps that tend to be fairly shallow. They like to forage in low oxygen water areas, which is where these lungfish are, and that bill has got a tip on it. It's one of the birds people enjoy most seeing when they come to our collection, and we show them one because I think most people have no idea it exists.
Oh yeah.
And so it definitely makes an impression. But they're really well adapted for what they do.
And they stand still for super long periods of time, which even their flapping of their wings is really slow when you see video of them. So everything about them is kind of quirky and unique and just fascinating. They terrorize. People must think of them as kind of the scariest of birds if you were to, because when they do move, they mean it.
Okay.
They mean business, and that hook on the end of that nail on the end of their bill is pretty scary. And if you see them grab a lungfish, you're like, it's a good thing I'm not a lungfish. Because that they're very efficient when it comes to that stuff.
The bill is so big, it's like disproportionate. Like I feel like when you see it, you can't believe that the rest of the body is like attached to this.
I think if you saw it though, in life standing up, the whole bird is so big. I think you might not be so bowled over in that way by the size of the beak, but it looks, when you see those pictures of it face on, it looks absolutely and utterly menacing.
It does. Yeah.
And I'd say, from an evolutionary sense, one of the most like gee whiz moments for me when it came out that it was a pelican is to say, yeah, pelicans have pretty weird bills too, and pretty big bills and pretty, modified bills. And so it's definitely, you can see the potential connectivity in the shape of those bills from an evolutionary standpoint. I mean, pelicans have these big pouches that are soft so that they can get water and fish in there, whereas the shoebill is all hard. But that's all about the prey items that they're eating and the way they're eating them.
Yeah.
I'd love to see, you shared that image of the roseate spoonbill skull next to the heron skull, and just seeing the way that the bill and the skull is all connected. I'd love to see what the shoebill looks like, just seeing that like all is one.
Yeah, I don't, do you think there's a skeleton?
So I was trying to remember that. I think the answer is yes, with the one caveat is that it's probably a zoo bird, and that means that the skull's a little bit cut up in order to do the necropsy once the bird dies before it comes to the museum.
Yeah, there's lots of really cool things about how beaks articulate into the skulls across birds. How much movement there is, what those articulations look like. There's fascinating. And then what beaks look like under the keratinized outer sheath is really interesting too. There's, at least in kingfishers, there's more variation under than over. So if you're just looking and measuring the outside of the beak, you're missing a lot of variability that happens under in the bone part of the beak. So there's lots of really cool things.
One of the things I always think about with fish-eating birds is that we tend to focus on the bill, which makes perfect sense. But these things also have to get these fish swallowed. And sometimes those things have a lot of bones and spikes on them. And the idea that you could potentially, say, swallow something tail first probably means you're going to be in big trouble if you're a shoebill or
a heron.
Or a heron,
Yeah.
And so I'm always interested in some of that.
I have a kind of dumb question. What's the difference between a bill and a beak?
Oh, good one.
Oh, that's a good
None.
question.
None? Okay.
Okay.
Some people will tell you one's more correct than the other.
Okay.
Oh, really?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have been so like when we talk about a shoe bill, I'm like, all right, I'm going to talk about the bill and not call it a beak. Like, I think there's a
No,
difference. So.
I think
Yeah.
I think
Okay.
either one is good.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, scientists ought not be so pedantic,
yeah.
right? But whatever. There's some times when it matters, but that's not a time.
Okay.
Beak or bill, that's not a time where it matters.
Okay. Good.
So I think another thing about shoebills that I find interesting is that they nest on floating vegetation or on islands, and there are lots of other wading birds that do that. But a whole bunch of others, like herons, have gone to these nesting in trees where they'll have these rookeries and things. And so I think a lot of that speaks to the fact that these areas where shoebill lives have been historically massive swamps without very many trees in them. And so the way they protect their eggs from predators and things is to try to use the water around them to keep things from coming in. And
Interesting. Huh. Amanda, didn't you read some folklore about
Yeah,
Shoebill?
just that that they're supposed to be like if a fisherman sees one, it's like a bad omen or like bad luck. And do either of you know anything about that?
yeah, those were fishermen that didn't catch anything.
Okay.
That's what I always say. It's like fishermen are usually superstitious, but it usually has to do with.
And my exact reaction would be opposite. Wow, look at that.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's
know
a
about
whole
that,
nother
Laura.
thing. You can absolutely imagine why there would be superstitions surrounding this bird because of how memorable it is just to see it. And I think that's true across birds too. So when you brought that up, I was thinking there's a legend about these potus, which are these nightjars from South America, and if they start calling around your house, someone's going to die. And again, I'm guessing that's probably happened before.
Oh.
And yet I don't think potus have any really imply that at all. And, but yeah, so yeah. I mean, the other thing with fishermen is that they're often worried that somebody's caught all the fish.
Oh.
And so maybe that was a situation too where the interesting thing about shoebills is they tend to be fairly solitary, so they're not around in big groups. But certainly with things like cormorants, fishermen in the Midwest are actually very worried about whether or not they're depleting the fish populations in some of their favorite lakes as a result of their population numbers going up.
John, when you saw a shoebill in the wild, were you going specifically to look for that, or did you happen to be there and happen to see one?
So kind of both. I mean, I was there to do research, and we had some extra time in Kampala, Uganda, which is the capital, and there was the guy who led local bird tours, and he said, we could go down to Mabamba Swamp and see shoebill, and I said, let's go.
Oh yeah.
And it was an amazing morning, and I think we saw 5 or 6 that morning. Just going out in a couple little boats with some other folks, and that's a standard place for lots of people to go.
Wow.
Yeah. One of my favorite stories about museum supporters was a couple that I'd gotten to know through various events and liked a lot. And one day I get an email from the wife of the couple, and she goes, "John, we just saw shoebill in Uganda." And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, these folks are just clearly not your typical people just running around. They're willing to go to Uganda and see shoebills, and I've always
They're not just
admired them for
glamping.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
It's not something that people typically do when they get to Uganda.
Oh right.
That's awesome.
Wow.
That's really cool.
Well, should we get into a mailbag question before we call it on this one?
Sure.
So this is from Rex in Streeterville,
There you go,
Chicago.
Rex. I like that.
Rex, yeah. Perfect.
Well done.
Rex.
Well done.
Speaking of Rex, he said, I really am enjoying each episode and keep learning more and more about birds that are new to me, as well as learning more about birds that are common. I've never gone birding, though, and I'm curious what advice you have to get started. Just 15 minutes ago, I saw out my window, not sure if it was a tanager, but it was a small bird with yellow under its wings. Would love to learn how to get better at identifying.
Yeah, you have to start.
Yeah.
I mean, you guys started and it got social for you. And I think for a lot of people, the social part is really important. But a lot of young bird people, they do things alone a lot. And I think there's a big problem with bird people being judgmental. And so that makes you afraid to say things because you might be wrong and probably are wrong a lot. So you have to be a little bit fearless, and you have to ask when you don't know what it is. And there are lots of tools that can help you. But they're not going to help you inside your house. Well, they will, but not the same way. You need to go outside. Mm-hmm. Eventually, you'll see birds, and once you identify them and see them over and over, they'll be in your memory banks. And then you can devote the rest of your memory to your brain to learning new ones. Mm-hmm. And then it can become inspiring, competitive, challenging. That's the interesting thing, because the more you watch, you'll get better at knowing what part of the bird guide to go to. Because at first you're like, okay, well, there's 600 pages in this book. What? I'll never be able to figure any of this out. There's how many little brown birds are there? Or it looks like there are hundreds. Mm-hmm. But eventually you just get better. So you get better at noticing what features it has. What kind of beak does it have? What kind of feet does it have? That'll give you clues into what it does. And that's really fun too, looking at birds and interpreting what they do, not just being able to identify them, but to look at them and say, oh, this thing climbs trees because it has a stiffened tail. This thing eats fish because look at its dagger-like beak. This thing eats seeds. It has very thick beaks. And so once you do that, you'll know where to go in the book. And once you've narrowed it down from, 600 species to 20, you'll be able to figure it out most of the time. Mm-hmm. And then if you learn vocalizations, then it becomes really challenging because you don't need to see the bird to know that it's there. And there are lots of apps that will help you. You can take pictures of what you see and ask an app to tell you, mm-hmm. What is it? What do you think it is? And you can use things like Merlin to help you with that and to help you identify the sounds that you hear. Yeah. I use Merlin all the time because I cannot remember for the life of me bird songs.
So what would you guys say is the key things that you gravitate to when you think about trying to identify something?
Yeah, Shannon just blew my mind that you use the Merlin app, because to me that's the biggest thing.
Yeah, I have a hard time with calls. Lately I've been paying attention to like flight pattern, which is something that I never paid attention to before. Like even just yesterday when we saw all the warblers, I was noticing the way that they kind of like do this little like kind of up and down.
Your brain is freed up enough to notice other things. Yeah, so if you do it enough, that's what happens. And then you get hooked on the challenge of figuring out what something is, or the challenge of interpreting what it does by what you see. Mm-hmm. And then
you start to notice one thing and that turns into another, and then you can kind of identify things differently.
Yeah. And then you should go into the museum, into the bird halls, and see all of the birds of the world in there. And then your mind will be even more blown, and you will have a much better appreciation for going outside when you go other places. Birds are everywhere.
Yeah. Well, and as you guys know, I mean, when you go traveling, there are going to be new birds.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
The farther afield you go, there are more and different ones.
Yes, yeah.
And I think this is an obvious one, but like binoculars make such a difference. Like we would look at birds in our yard, and the second we got binoculars, it's just like, oh my gosh, you can see the detail, you can see the color. There's things that.
So I have to say, like the early ornithologists clearly had eyesight that was probably better than ours in a lot of ways.
Oh right.
I'm not sure that's necessarily true, but yeah, without binoculars, it wouldn't be anywhere near as fun.
Learning how to use binoculars is probably something that Rex should do.
Yeah.
Because if you put the binoculars on your eyes when you're looking at the ground and then try to find a bird from something that's magnified tenfold, it gets really frustrating.
It's a skill.
So you have to find the bird with your eyes and then put your binoculars on your eyes, and then you won't have such trouble. When we teach ornithology, you can always tell city kids from country kids. And walking off of a cement path is one of the things, but the whole not looking down all the time when you walk. So if you're a bird person, you're not going to walk around looking down. So look out, look up.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
you're not going to see that many birds on the ground.
Yes. And to Shannon's point, I always think like when we go birding, it's like a tech neck cure, because you're like hyperextending your neck in the other way, which is so good when we're all like looking at our phones all day or at the computer and stuff. Yeah. So, and then I wanted to, for Rex's question, like I'm really into the Merlin photo ID part. Like I love, like yesterday we took a picture just out of our front window and then put it into the Merlin app and, you know, got to learn about that bird. So that's another thing I think is so cool about the Merlin app is just, you know, if you can catch a picture, it's really fun to do that.
Yeah.
And then ultimately your observations, you can be part of community science programs, and your observations will make a difference. Even if it's just in your yard for a few minutes, you record the birds that you see, you put it in a public database, and they all contribute to the knowledge of birds. And so I think whatever angle you want to take, you can find your pathway through birds.
All right, but here's the $10,000 question. What did Rex see?
Oh.
Yeah, I want to know too.
Yeah, we'll have to find out now.
I always love
He thought it
guessing
was a
on those
tanager.
things.
Yeah.
So yellow under the wings. I'm going to guess it's not a tanager.
Yeah.
It's hard to tell size-wise what he saw, so that's another thing. This time of year, I was going to guess maybe something like American redstart because they're a lot moving through right now. But that's just a guess.
Yeah.
If it's small.
Yeah.
And
Tell
when
'em
people
to-
ask us those things, I like
Rex,
those are I enjoy
write
trying
us
to
back.
figure those out.
Yeah. Rex, write us
Yeah,
back.
Rex,
is
give us
right.
more detail.
We get a lot of calls like that,
Oh.
you know, and random pictures sent from all over the world. Can you tell me what this is? Like, man, it's not in focus. I don't think I can. Maybe John can. Actually, I can't even get it to the bird family. So I'm bad at this.
All right, well, I think that's a good place to stop for today. John, do you want to close it out?
Yeah, you know, watch your birds and make notes on what you see.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. If you enjoyed our podcast, please help spread the word and also give us a follow on Instagram. We're still trying to get the word out there and would appreciate any publicity that we can get. We also want to thank Earhole Studios in Chicago for helping us record. If you have a question for John, Shannon, Amanda, and I, feel free to send it to podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com or reach out to us on Instagram.